morning. It is 2:50 on January 6th. I am going to make a couple of videos to try and record my labor and delivery experiences with both my son and my daughter. I have my notes on my tablet through my Kindle app, and I'm going to try and do this kind of as quick as I can. Both notes that I typed up ended up being like 4 pages. My son's is just barely over 4 pages. My daughter's is like almost a full 4 pages. So I'm just going to try and go through this as kind of fast as I can. But I just wanted to share my experience, as well as from these 2 experiences what I'm hoping I can, expect this time around. So with my daughter, she was born via emergency C-section on December 6th of 2002. And she was born 7 pounds, 2 ounces, 19.5 inches long at 9:29 p.m. So the week before, on November 28th or 29th, I had been in my doctor's office. The weekend prior to that had been my baby shower, and since I had been home from the baby shower, because we had it back in my hometown at the time, my ex-husband and I, we lived up in East Chicago, Indiana. It was about 2.5 hours away. But since we had gotten back to EC from being home for the weekend, my daughter hadn't been moving a whole lot and stuff. So like that week I had already had a doctor's appointment, and whatever, just a day or 2 later, because this was like a Tuesday, I think, somewhere in there. So I had told her about the lack of movement and stuff, which she said, as late as it was, that it was kind of to be expected because baby was running out of room. So she went ahead and checked me in the office, and at that time I was between 1 and 2 centimeters, but not effacing at all or anything like that. And she said that she was feeling little parts at my cervix playing with her hand. At this time, I became concerned that baby might be breech. She was like, "Oh no, it's probably just her hand up above her head," and she was like, the parts felt too little to be, or too long to be toes. Both my ex-husband and I have long, skinny toes, and so I was not trying to dismiss the fact that she quite possibly was breech, as well as where I had pain. I had up here, I had a lot of pain in my ribs up here, where it just was just heavy pressure all the time, from about, I don't know, I'd say like 7.5, 8 months along was when I started having that pain. And so she, had said, no. I said, well, can we get an ultrasound just to confirm that she's not that way? We can try and turn her if she is. And she was like, oh no, it's almost a month till your due date. She's got plenty of time to turn. Which I knew from when I knew my last menstrual period was, that I was not a month away from my due date. I was actually a couple of days over my due date at this point. But because of when I had my 20-week ultrasound done, they were going by those measurements, and baby was measuring for Christmas rather than Thanksgiving, like what I had figured up. I had figured my due date to be Thanksgiving, and because of her size and a couple of other things, they were guessing closer to like this. I think they had made like December 22nd or 24th is what they tried to say my due date was. And no matter how much I tried to refute this and deny this, they would not listen to me about it. Partly, I guess, because it was my first labor, or my first baby, and, well, it was not my first pregnancy, it was my second pregnancy, but because it was my first baby and stuff, they just credited I just didn't know anything. So, went like another week, and the night of the 5th was when I actually kind of started laboring. I didn't have any pains. Um, my feet were swelling really bad, and to help combat the swelling, I ended up trying to prop my feet up, get them elevated, and so I was laying back on the couch and had taken the cushions off of the love seat and had propped them up. So I had basically 3 cushions and a couple pillows, so I was sitting like this with my feet up on top, and they were still swelling and stuff, but I stayed home because I really didn't have any other way to the hospital, and I didn't think it was that big of a, or didn't know that it could have been that big of a deal. So I guess I really didn't know, that much about pregnancy and everything, but I mean, I knew when, I knew about my body. So, that was that. And then, so that next morning on the 6th, I decided to go ahead and go into the hospital. It had been probably about 5 or 6 hours. Well, no, it was more than that, probably 8 or 9 hours, since my feet had started swelling before I left to head to the hospital. And I had to take city bus, which, it being in December, it was winter. We lived off of Lake Michigan, so we had a lot of lake effect snow, things like that. Roads were not wonderful. There were only 2 buses that I could catch out of where we lived, and one of them was not running. So my only option was to take the mall bus, which the mall bus actually goes from East Chicago, where we lived, up to Hammond to the Woodmore Mall, and then from Hammond to Griffith, Indiana, and then from Griffith back into town on the other side of East Chicago where the hospital was. And to take that bus that day, because of the weather and everything, it was almost a 3-hour ride. It wasn't anything that was overly concerning to me or anything, because like I said, I didn't really feel like anything was going on. So, I wasn't in a rush to get to the hospital and then find out that, nothing serious was going on, and had I used emergency transportation, I would have felt stupid and whatever else. So by the time I arrived to the hospital, it was about 3:30, 4 o'clock, maybe 4:30. I mean, it had been a few hours, like I said, because it was just shortly after 12, I would say, that I actually got on the bus, and it was almost a 3-hour ride, getting around and stuff, not figuring in, all the stops on that route. So once I got to the center, they took my blood pressure, and my blood pressure was very high. It was 174 over about 48, I believe, which was crazy for me. I've always had really low blood pressure all my life until probably in the last 2 or 3 years. My blood pressure has seemed to kind of normalize, if not be a little on the high side, and now since I'm pregnant, it has been on the high side. But normal range for me, I was used to being like 110 to like 120s over like 40s, like 40 to 60. Usually, like, my blood pressure, most common for me, would be like 112 over like 47. That was like average norm for me, which is really, really on the low side, but that's how mine had been my whole life. So with that, they decided I had hypertension. I needed to be admitted so that I could be monitored and everything else. So I was checked in. I was put into my own room within 45 minutes. They had me hooked up on a monitor, and baby's heartbeat was going great. My daughter's heartbeat was in the 150s to 160s range, which is what it had been the whole time. Pretty much every time I had gotten her heartbeat monitored, 157 to 158 was pretty much her norm. That was like the only two numbers in my whole little booklet for her heartbeat, like every time that it had been done. So after they did that, they got the monitor going and, got her heartbeat checked, and also seen that I was having contractions, which I was feeling some cramping here and there, but nothing nearly close to, what I could compare to, like, it had been like my menstrual cramps or anything. So there weren't anything that I was really thinking too much of. The nurse checked me. I was about 3 or 4 centimeters dilated and was not effacing at all yet. So my midwife and my doctor were called, which at this point I had not even like met my doctor yet. The doctor's office that I used, she had her own midwife, and unless you were high risk, the midwife was who handled you the entire pregnancy. She was the one that saw you every week and had, your appointments with you, and was the one that delivered you unless there were some kind of special circumstances like a C-section. Otherwise, you never saw Dr. Adams. So after they were called, my nurse had asked me if I was having contractions, or if I felt like I was having contractions, and then proceeded to sit down in the room with me and told me to tell her every time I felt a contraction. So every time I told her I felt a contraction, she would make a mark on my monitor ribbon, and did that for probably about 15-20 minutes or so. And after a little while, she explained to me what she was doing. She told me that I in fact was having very regular contractions every 2 to 4 minutes, but I was only feeling contractions every like 6 to 8 minutes, and the contractions that I was feeling were going off of the color ribbon section of the contraction monitoring graph on the monitor paper. And so those were the only contractions I was feeling. I was having lots of other regular contractions in between there, but it was the ones that were way big that, she said any other normal person, those would have been contractions that would have had people doubling over and screaming in pain. Those were ones that I was just kind of going, oh, yeah, I don't like that, but okay, and then, like, it was done. So, we went from there, and my midwife showed up and confirmed that I was in active labor. She went ahead and checked me again, and said that she felt those little parts again. And so since I was in the birthing center, she decided we'll go ahead and get the portable ultrasound machine and we'll check baby's presentation. So they did that. Turned out my daughter was breech, and her head was right under my ribs, so here in the left side of my ribs, where I was having so much pain, which still now are very painful because they're my ribs that my ex-husband has broke when I was abused and battered by him and stuff. But I mean, she probably added to some of the pain and stuff that I get in those ribs. But her head was underneath my ribs, like actually inside my rib cage. Her bottom was over here, just below my rib cage. So her head was underneath my floating ribs. Her feet were in my birth canal, and her umbilical cord was hanging straight down to her feet. And she was actually playing with that with her toes. So she had toes like me. And so I asked the midwife at that point, I said, well, can we try and flip her? The midwife said, sure, we'll give it a shot and see what we can do. We attempted to do that for probably 20 minutes to half an hour, trying to flip her. There were 3 nurses, myself, and the midwife, I believe. We had one nurse that was holding the ultrasound wand to, watch baby move so that we could, work on presentation. And we were turning her this way so that her head had to come around because of how the umbilical cord was and how her feet were If we tried to turn her the short way, she would have ended up folded in half and her feet would have been with her head, and it would have been a little bit harder. So they were trying to turn her the other way so that her feet kind of folded behind her towards her bottom, and then we would have, kind of flipped her up that way. And it started with just the two nurses and two nurses and midwife trying to turn. They ended up asking me to help as well because we would go so far, and then they'd have me put my hand down really hard to try and hold her head so that a couple of them could move their hands to keep going. So there would be like one nurse holding her bottom and I'd be holding her head, and then the other nurse and the midwife would pick their hands up to shift to try and get a new way, and we'd get her about halfway around and then she'd flip right back into place. She refused to turn, absolutely was not turning. So at that point, the midwife said, well, I'm going to call, Doc Adams and tell her what's going on. So she went and she told Doc Adams, what was going on, told her my status and the status of the baby. Doc Adams told her, well, we're going to go ahead and do a C-section in the morning then. I'll get the operating room scheduled for 8 o'clock in the morning and we'll do a C-section. So this was by about 7:30 by this point, and my midwife came back in the room to relay all this information that Doc Adams had just told her. And as she was telling me, a nurse came over the intercom to my room, telling my midwife, Doc Adams is on her way. She's going to take her into emergency C-section tonight. And I had just been told I was going to have a C-section, which completely blew all of my birthing plans out the window and had upset me because I wasn't going to be able to do what I wanted to do. But I was still kind of thinking, okay, I've got till 8 o'clock in the morning, so I've got, 13 hours almost that I can come to grips with this and hopefully be able to cope with this and be able to decide in the morning that I can handle this. I had never had any type of surgery or anything before this point, so I was terrified about that aspect, as well as I had a birth plan worked up that obviously if I had a C-section it was going to change that complete birth plan. And so as the nurse is telling me that, then this intercom message comes up, and my whole idea of, okay, I can figure out how to cope with this over the next 12 hours, that was gone, because now it went from, it was going to be 12 hours before I had a C-section to it was going to be about a half an hour, 45 minutes before I was on the operating table. And so they ended up getting me an IV, which before that I had refused because I have some allergies with certain medical things. My mom and I both do. And because I was planning on doing a natural birth, they hadn't given me an IV line because we weren't expecting to need it. And so they had to come in, they had to do an IV, they had to give me a cath, and they were reeling me into the operating room by 7:45. Like it was like 15 minutes from the time that she told me you're going to have a C-section in the morning to I was leaving for an emergency C-section that night. And so they got all that done, and once I was in the operating room, I swear they have the skinniest tables for the operating tables, and I had to get onto that table and get ready to prepare to have my spinal. We had opted to do a spinal because my mom had had a C-section both with myself and my sister, my older sister, and with my sister they had given her an epidural, which she ended up having a bad reaction to. My allergies, I guess you could call them, that I have from like IVs and some other medical things come from my mom. They're all things that my mom and I have in common with, certain things. We have to have a certain ratio saline solution. We can't have, pure IV. I mean, there's just certain things and stuff. And so because of the fact that spinals and epidurals are such a heavy anesthetizer, they wanted to be careful with it. And since my mom had a bad reaction, and several of the other bad medical reactions she had had appeared to share so far, they figured they'd be safe to do the spinal. So they went ahead, started prepping me for the spinal, and the nurse that was in there, who was at the end of the table to hold me, I told her, I was like, you're gonna have to catch my body. She was like, what do you mean? I was like, I'm not gonna be here for this. I said, I'm about to go. And I know some of you are gonna think this is absolutely crazy, but this, honest to God, is what happened. I believe in traveling outside of your body, and that is what I did. I was not about to be there for it, because I didn't like the idea of a needle going into my back, injecting medicine around my spinal cord that, potentially, if something happened wrong, I could be paralyzed or anything else. I was like, just nervous about it. And I remember watching myself get the spinal from the corner of the room over by the door to the operating room. And then, next thing I know, I was kind of being shook, and the nurse had asked me, she was like, what just happened? And I was like, I told you I was leaving. And she was like, well, you definitely did. She said, because it seemed like I was holding you, and it was like I could feel the life in your body, and then all of a sudden you just went limp. She said, I had to ask the, anesthetologist if he had given the epidural or giving you your spinal yet, and he had said no. So I was like really confused, because you were just gone all of a sudden. She was like, it was almost like you fainted, but I could tell there just wasn't, the same type of life essence with you or something. Like, she was like, I just don't know how to explain it. She said it was weird. And she took it for what it was, and she was like, that's awesome that you could have, you were able to do something like that. She said, because, he did your spinal perfectly fine. She was like, and had you not done that, she said, I don't think it would have ended that way. So after they got the spinal in, they got me laid down, put the sheet up, and started operating. Dr. Adams was trying to tell me what she was doing, and after about 2 or 3 steps, I was like, look, you need to stop, because you're making me nauseous. I don't want to hear. The light at top, they had to turn it just a little bit, because I remember that if I looked straight up, I could see the reflection of what was going on in that light. And so they had to turn it just to cut that reflection off. And I mean, it was just, I had a really hard time, whatever with it. And then, the only thing she, did tell me again was right as she was pulling my daughter out. She was like, now you're going to feel some pressure. She said, that's your daughter coming out. So at 9:29, my daughter was out. And she said, the doctor said at that time, well, maybe you were right about your birth, your actual due date and stuff. And I was like, what makes you say that? And she was like, well, she has no lingual hair, no vernix, and she just pooped right as I was pulling, right as she was pulling her out and stuff. So she felt that, I was probably more accurate on, whatever. So they got her out. They showed her to me for a split 5 seconds, and then whisked her over to the natal table to start cleaning her up and, doing whatever. Doc finished cleaning me up, cleaning everything out. Did find scar tissue from my triplets that I had miscarried before I got pregnant with my daughter, cleaned that up, and started getting me sewn back up. And they took her out of the room, and then I was being reeled into recovery. Once I got to recovery, they told me that I would have to be staying there until I could move my legs again on my own and have, feeling from my midline down and whatever. And at that time, I had asked for my daughter to be brought in to me. I said, I planned on breastfeeding, and I had wanted, the skin time and, whatever and stuff. I said, so I needed her brought to me. and they told me, you know, oh, no, we've got her in the nursery cleaning her up and feeding her and whatever. And I said, again, I intended on breastfeeding. I said, at the very least, bring me a pump so that I can express the milk for to be taken to her in the nursery if that's what you guys need to do and stuff while I'm recovering. And they were like, oh no, you don't want to breastfeed, that's such a big mistake, and no one breastfeeds anymore, and you'll find out that it's more trouble than what it's worth, and it's just too hard, and blah 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 blah. And I had just started getting really irate, and I was loopy a little bit from the medicine, but this was just really, it was sobering me up. And the only thing that was keeping me from coming off the table at the woman to go after her and go get my daughter was the fact that I couldn't move my legs. I was paralyzed from the waist down. And she said that they couldn't bring my daughter to me for medical safety reasons until I was recovered from the spinal. And I told her that I didn't give a flying poop what her opinion was of breastfeeding. It was my child, and if I was going to breastfeed her, I was going to breastfeed her, and nobody was going to tell me different. And she just pretty much brushed me off and walked off. And so it was at this point that the experience that had already started getting bad for me at 7:30 really took a nosedive. I was in recovery for about 4 hours. The only good nurse that I'd had my entire time that I was there, which was the one that had caught me when I was getting my spinal, or held me while I was getting my spinal, she was gone. I didn't see her again the rest of that night or over the next 2 days. I didn't see her again until Monday morning before we were getting discharged. And so I'm restrained to this bed, and during that time that I was in the recovery, I either was cussing the nurses out because I wanted my daughter and they were not trying to listen to me and whatever and stuff, or I was crying because I didn't have her with me and my whole birth plan was out the window. And I hadn't had the time to cope with the idea of a C-section yet, and then it was just trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma getting added to it. And so it started getting really hard for me. So after about 4 hours, I finally was able to take my hands and pull my legs up towards my chest so that my knees were bent and my legs would flop out, and I could pull them up about so far before I didn't have enough muscle to do it anymore. They finally said that this was good enough to take me back to my room. They said that they would like a little bit more movement than that, typically even, possibly the, patient being able to, walk a little bit. But this was all they were getting out of me, and I'm sure that they were getting tired of me because I had turned into crazy evil bitch, because the whole situation was just pissing me off more and more the more that went on. So I got back to my room. My daughter was brought in to me, and at that point I had told the nurse that brought her in, I said, I need a lactation nurse to come so that I can get some help with breastfeeding my daughter, because that is my plan and that's what I wanted to do. So the nurse that had brought her in, she was like, oh, she doesn't need fed, we just fed her in the nursery. She was like, she's been taking the bottle in the nursery just fine. She said, you'll be happier if you don't breastfeed. It's easier to bottle feed. Breastfeeding's just too hard. Then left my room. Didn't give me a chance to respond or anything, which I was almost stunned that I was almost speechless, to the point where I really didn't have, whatever to respond. But I was getting so irate by this time that I pressed the nurse call button, and another nurse came in, and I repeated to her that I needed a lactation nurse to come and help me so I could breastfeed my daughter. And it was at that time she told me that I would have to wait until Monday, that I would probably have to come back with my daughter because they expected me to probably be discharged by Sunday. Um, that the lactation nurse was not on call for the weekend, and so there was no way for me to have a lactation nurse there. And by this time it's, early wee hours of the morning, like 8 a.m., 8 in the, on the 7th. It was, I'd say probably 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. Because I came out of operation about 10:30. Then, like I said, I had the 4 hours in, in the operation room, 4.5 hours or so in post-op recovery. And so, it was the middle of the night, but I didn't care. I was like, she needs to be called, so the first thing in the morning she can be here. And they told me that was just going to be impossible. And then she was like, well, then let me check your breast. So the nurse came over and pulled my gown out and checked my breast, and she was like, well, you have inverted nipples, so you're not going to be breastfeeding, not going to be able to breastfeed anyway, so you might as well put that thought out of your head. And I was producing milk, but I did have, flat nipples, which had been something I had already discussed with my midwife. And she said that there were ways that we would be able to, help remedy that and everything. And so, she said that because of the inverted nipples, there would be no point. So at this point now, my birth plan had been thrown out the window. My bonding time had been robbed from me. And I was also losing my battle at planning to breastfeed. I felt like such a failure as a mom, and I hadn't even been a mom yet for 12 hours, not even hardly 8 hours I hadn't been a mom. And so it was just, like I said, it was just more trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma. And so then the rest of the weekend passed. They had me get up and walk the halls as much as I could. And then had told me that I wouldn't be discharged until I had a BM. So, like, I would keep, try and keep my daughter in the room with me. Every time she closed her eyes, I would try and take advantage of the time, and I would, try and, rest. And every time that happened, they would whisk her out of the room, and I would wake up to my daughter being gone and not in the room, only to find out that they've taken her back to the nursery to clean her up, give her a bottle, do this, do that. All kinds of stuff that they weren't even letting me do at all. And it was just, it was pissing me off so bad. So Monday morning was when the good nurse returned. The nurse who had been there during my operation, she was back Monday morning, asked me how the weekend had been, and I told her how horrible it was. She immediately got pissed off. She went into the nursery. She said that my daughter needed to be put back in my room with me, and she was not to leave my room, again. She said that the lactation nurse needed to be called, that she was supposed to have been called, days prior. She said that she should have been called and notified, late Friday night, early Saturday morning, and that she needed to, be called right then so that she could get there. And she was just off the wall on all the nurses. And she had said that all of my requests, none of it was in any of my notes, like in my patient folder or anything. And so she had told me that the nurses, the things that they had said, they had no right saying those kind of things. They had no right denying me a lactation nurse. She said that the lactation nurse was in fact on call during the weekend. She said it sounded like they were just being lazy or whatever and stuff. So she made me feel a lot better, and she got the lactation nurse there and everything. So the lactation nurse got there. She had checked my breasts as well, confirmed that I did have the inverted nipple. She was like, but that's no problem. She says, we got ways to get around that. She said, there's breast shields. She said, we could even just take a regular bottle nipple and you just put it over your regular nipple. Your daughter will create the suction that will hold the bottle nipple there, and she'll be able to feed that way. She said, and since the nurses have been bottle feeding her already, she says she's going to have a hard time latching onto your natural breast as it is. She said, so, you know, even had your nipples been, you know, normal, she said, we probably still would have had to do this for a little bit of time. I hated having to use the bottle nipple. It took me almost 3 or 4 months to wean her off of it afterwards. It was almost that long before she would latch on without it, and before the bottle nipple had served its purpose of helping to draw my nipples out to make it possible for her to latch on. But it worked. It happened. So if there's any girls out there who are worried about whether they're going to breastfeed or not because that's how their nipples are, that's how you do it. It's not impossible. Just because you have inverted nipples does not mean it cannot happen. It's perfectly possible. So, like, by that point, I finally felt like I was doing right by my daughter. I was finally having a bonding time with her. She was latched on. She was breastfeeding. I had actually breastfed her probably 3 or 4 times before we were discharged that late afternoon on Monday morning. And we went home, and that was my experience with having my daughter. A lot of it was not peaches and cream. It was one of the worst hospital experiences I have ever had in my life, still to this day. And it is nothing that I would wish on anybody, and definitely nothing I would ever want to have to repeat. And it is what it is. So that was my birth with my daughter. And I'll go ahead and make another video to talk about the birth of my son. And we'll see you all later.